Welcome, everybody. I'm Brooke Lovelace, the director of the Iowa Developmental Disabilities Council. Thanks for joining us today on a Friday in the summer when it's super nice out. Today, we are just going to do a recap of the state update from session. We're going to do a federal update. We're going to share some tips on how you can do some federal advocacy over the summer and maybe a to-do list for you to do and report back to us on how you did in August when we meet again. And then we do desperately need some input from you guys on our legislative agenda for this next session that we hope to put together this summer so it's set to go in the fall. So with that, I'm going to turn it over, I believe, to Amy, who's fearless working with us today, even though she's really under the weather. So bear with us this morning. Go ahead, Amy, if you can.
Yep. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. I apologize if I go on mute for a few minutes. It's just because I can't talk for very long without coughing. So I apologize for that. Love the summer colds. But I just wanted to give a quick update on where we're at right now with at the state before we move into the federal, which there's a lot of discussion going on at the federal level. And so we have some good opportunities to advocate there. But right now, the governor has signed all bills. So she did that the first week of June on the Friday before she had to have everything signed. So in all, she signed everything, but did veto one bill and line item veto, which is vetoing out a specific section of a budget bill. But none of them really pertain to anything that we've been watching. One dealt with federal funding for the Chief Information Office, and one dealt with how public defenders are appointed when somebody can't afford to have an attorney represent them. So all the other bills that we had talked about in our last presentation were signed into law. And again, if you weren't on our May Capitol Chat, you can get the recording and the PowerPoint on our website under Capitol Chat. So it's under the InfoNet tab of iowaddcouncil.org. And it's under Capitol Chat. So you can find all of that stuff there. And you will also find all of these PowerPoints there as well. I always like to watch how many bills get introduced every year, because we really have always said about 1 in 10 or 1 in 11 bills make it to the governor's desk. And that's pretty consistent again this year. There were almost 2,000 bills and resolutions introduced. And of those, 169 bills were sent to the governor, so 9%, so 1 in 9 bills that were introduced. There are 94 bills that we tracked in InfoNet, and some of those were duplicate, companion bills or bills that multiple people introduced separately. And of those, 25 were signed. I did want to note, you probably might have been hearing about this, but since the Iowa Supreme Court made a ruling on an abortion bill, I apologize. They want to have a special session to address that. So basically, the court just said, we're not going to allow the, they call it the heartbeat ban. So once a heartbeat is detected, about 8 weeks, abortions can happen after that. And so they had already passed once a constitutional amendment that said Iowans don't have the right to an abortion to be put into our Constitution. What I'm hearing is on July 10th, they'll all come back into session for a day and do the second passage of that. Just as a reminder, to change our Constitution, you have to pass it twice in 2 different General Assemblies. So once in 1 year, 2-year period, and once in the second 2-year period. And then it goes to the ballot. So this is something that any voter in Iowa is going to be voting on in 2024 when you're electing a president and legislators in November next year. So I just wanted to make a note of that. They will come back into special session. They will try to stay to that only one issue, and they probably will, since they have strong majorities. But they could bring up other issues. You can't just have a special session for just one issue. It opens up everything. So then also wanted to do an update. We will try to keep updating our website to have all of the information on all of the reorg going on in Health and Human Services. I know a lot of you I've recognized and seen on town hall meetings, whether they're the regular Medicaid town halls or the one on reimbursement, the one on home health that they've had. There's just so many things going on with HHS. We will try to make sure we always have those listed. And I'm going to try to get some of those added to our calendar so we have them there as well, because I'm even losing track of when meetings were. I had 2 meetings yesterday with HHS, and I forgot about the Medicaid town hall. So I'm going to work on doing that over the next week to try to get all of those HHS town halls on our calendar as well. So if you ever get confused, you can look there as well. But you probably noticed there's a service efficiency review. They announced that they've hired a company to look at, really it's looking at how all services are delivered. And right now, HHS has a lot of different regions, whether they're child welfare, mental health, substance use. They're looking at some new regions, and then public health is not regioned. So that's county-based, and I think there are some desire to make that regional as well. So they're going to be looking at trying to put a uniform service delivery map together. I don't know if they'll be able to do that, but that's something to watch, because that will change how services are delivered, or has the potential to change those. We also know that there's going to be a look at all the boards and commissions and whether they can merge those further than what they did in that last one. And then, of course, there's the ongoing waiver review process that they are doing. And there's just a lot going on, right, at HHS. So it's hard to keep up on everything. And so we're going to try to put it all in one place for you on our website. I'm just going to move on to the next section. I can pause really quickly if anybody wants to put something into the chat before we do that on the state stuff, or raise your hand. I can't see the chat, so hopefully somebody can take a look and see. I'll just wait a second here. Take a drink of water. Okay, I'm going to move on. If you do think of something, go ahead and put it in the chat, or we'll have a time before we move on after federal to ask questions as well. I'm going to try to cover a lot of this, and then I'm hoping that Carlin and Brooke will add in, because they have been in contact with their federal group, organization, association, to really get the impacts of this. But I know a lot of you heard earlier this summer the discussion about the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023, which was signed into law on June 3rd. This is what everybody called the debt ceiling bill. The U.S. has a total amount of trillions of dollars that we can borrow to pay our bills. And I did have a spelling error there that I didn't catch. But the debt ceiling bill did impact a lot of some of the things that we were watching, and has some real concern for individuals with disabilities. The first thing is it did suspend the debt ceiling, so it allows the U.S. to borrow more than that amount, or have a debt bigger than that amount, and till January 2025. And that's a really important piece, because we've been doing this like regularly, increasing it, and not really addressing underlying issues with spending. And so for that situation, this at least stops the fight over that for another couple years, rather than just delaying it a year at a time. But it did include, there's some negotiations that happened, but it did include spending cuts that could have really drastic impact to some of the services and programs that Iowans with disabilities may receive. It included some work requirements. So the feds are doing a lot of what we talked about here in Iowa, and it takes back some of the unspent pandemic aid to states, which we may or may not have to repay. I'm not sure where Iowa is right now. We're not very transparent on how we've spent our pandemic aid. But it does include a 1% increase for the next fiscal year, which in the federal government starts this September. But since that's lower than inflation, a lot of the federal organizations are saying this is really a cut because 1% won't cover the cost and growth in demand for services. So, and the cost to deliver them. So 1% increase is really not an increase at all. If Congress cannot pass a budget by the 1st of next year, there will be an automatic cut going back to the fiscal year 2023 budget. So that's not the year we're in, but the year last year's federal fiscal year, and a 1% cut. So that really goes back in time to make a pretty large cut. So, you know, there's really not a lot known about it right now on how this is gonna impact, you know, the money. It depends on how much comes back. It depends on what kind of some of these side deals that were made and how they implement these changes. So we're going to be listening pretty closely. What I did want to note is that eligibility for Medicaid is not changed. So work requirements were not added to that. So similar to what was done with our asset test, this really in the state level, the work requirements are going to apply to SNAP, which is food assistance, and TANF, which is temporary aid to needy families. And so that's things like child care, and other forms and services that pay for services to parents of children. It also, they increased the age which work requirements apply to. So instead of 49, which is concurrent, the work requirements will be required for childless recipients up to age 54. So older people will need to continue to work. It exempts a few groups, the unhoused or homeless, former foster kids, and veterans, but it does not mention people with disabilities. Does not specifically exempt somebody from work requirements because of a disability. So I think that's really important to make note of. I'm going to pause there and see if Brooke or Carlin have more to add on that.
I'll just add in that, you know, what we're hearing is a little bit scary and depressing for programs and organizations like ours that work with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and for anyone with disabilities or those who need assistance. The 1%, you know, cut, if it gets to that, you know, might be something we obviously don't want. We obviously would even like more than a 1% increase, but a 1% cut is looking good to what it could be, which for our organization, they're even predicting it could be up to 9%. And in the House Republicans' budget that they are proposing, labor, HHS, and education could be looking at almost a 30% cut together. So it's something that we're obviously looking at and monitoring. And, you know, we've been told it's going to be a long and bumpy road between now and September, and it could go longer. The good thing about the, you know, if the budgets aren't passed by the first of the year, is that 1% cut also, it will be faced by the other programs in the budget that the House GOP wants to have an increase. And so if they don't pass something by January, then everybody will get a 1% cut, and that's not what they want. So that will probably hurry them along to get something passed before the end of the year. But you know, hopefully it will not be as drastic as what is being predicted. And you know, it looks like the House is the place where the draconian cuts, as they're being called, are being suggested in the Senate is probably going to be a little bit more bipartisan and hopefully neutral on some of these things. So we're getting, dire news from our national office and from what we're hearing for programs like ours. And so we, hope if you have concerns about that and programs that, assist those that you work with or you in Iowa that are federally funded, that you will make your voice heard to your members of Congress about what the effects could be for you. And we're going to talk today more about how you can do that too. So,
yeah, I would just to add on to the having to pass a budget by January 1 of next year. You might know this already, but Congress hasn't been passing budgets. They've been doing continuing resolutions, which means we're just going to keep going because we can't agree on a budget. They're going to have to get something agreed to. So that's a lot of work. And so I think there are opportunities to talk to our federal folks and our federal legislators to really look at how they can avoid some of those more draconian cuts that they're being proposed. And certainly Iowa's delegation is in a position to do that in the House, which is controlled by Republicans. That we have, our delegation is entirely Republican, so they are in the majority and are in a position to try to make some changes there. I did want to go on to another piece that some of you may have heard about from other agencies that you work with. Since this is really time sensitive, we wanted to concentrate on this today. But there are 2 rules being proposed at the federal level. And there are a number of ways to make changes. One is Congress can pass legislation, and the other is through the rulemaking process, which is on the president's side, the executive branch. Those federal agencies can do that. And they always have to pass rules to implement the laws that are passed, but they also have a lot of latitude to be able to make some real policy changes in the rulemaking process. On April 27th, so we were kind of in the middle of session at the end, closed down at that point, CMS released 2 notices of proposed rulemaking. Those are often called NPRMs. You may see that acronym places, but that's what if you see that means notice of proposed rulemaking. So they're basically giving the public notice that they're going to look at making these changes, which they have to do, and then they have to receive feedback. So the 2 rules that are called the access rule and the managed care rule, the goal of these is to eliminate barriers that people with disabilities face trying to get quality health care. So between the 2 of them, they set national standards for access to health care, regardless of whether it's managed care or fee-for-service, like traditional Medicaid, which we had before the MCOs. Transparency for Medicaid provider rates, which are not transparent right now at all. And they're including making sure that there is public awareness of how providers pay direct care workers and what their hourly rates are, so that you can see the variation throughout the provider community on how much they're paid and what their rates are. Right now, those are not known, and really providers can't share that between them because of federal rules. So that's a very, very important piece that I think people might miss. The other issue is that it would require 80% of the rate that goes to direct. It would require 80% of the reimbursement go directly to direct care worker compensation instead of administration. So it basically caps those administrative rates at 20% of what their provider rate is. And I think that's probably more applicable to things like nursing homes and hospitals than it is actually some of the providers that I think they have a higher rate that goes directly to their worker compensation. From my understanding is it's a very high rate. And it depends again on how that administration is defined in those rules, whether they include like janitors or meals and other things that are offered in a place. It does empower beneficiary choice, which is always something that we promote, is individual choice in how they want to, how individuals want their services delivered and where they want them delivered, to provide more accountability in the system. And then it applies to both Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program, which in Iowa we call Hawkeye. So I didn't want to go through the rules really too much today, but you can read those at those links. I shortened the links because they were so long. So I shortened the links there for you, but you can read both the rules at those links. And then they are receiving comments until July 3rd. So I have not personally read through all of the rules, but I plan to do so. And if I find them really complicated, I will work with Carlin to get those summarized a little bit better early next week to try to give you the high points in those if you want to make comment. But if you click on those comment links, you will have an email that you can send your comments to. And I really encourage people to do that, because these, as you can see, potentially could really address some of the things we've been trying to do at the state level, but not been able to do because of how our system is organized right now, and the legislature's composition. So I think this is an opportunity to do that without having to try to get a bill passed and try to move that needle. So again, comments are due by July 3rd. I'm going to stop there because I'm coughing again and see if anybody has any questions on either. Let's see, we have some in the chat. I did get that to show again. I don't know.
That's just our comments, Amy. There hasn't been any questions yet.
Okay.
I was trying to put those links in the chat as links, but I'm not sure they came up as links. So they're there. Might have to copy and paste.
I did that. Thank you, Carolyn, for doing that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, again, later today, I'll have the PowerPoints up online. So I believe the links will be on live on those PDFs, but if they're not, you can copy and paste them too. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact Brooke, Carlin, or I about those. I can, if somebody wants to put our emails in the chat, amy@ialobby.com, and Carlin and Brooke's long DHS email. DHS still for now, I guess. I don't know if your emails are changing to HHS, but
They will eventually change to iowa.gov, and I cannot wait for that to happen.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Everybody else is doing that, and here I can put mine in. Just feel free to send it to all or one of us if you have questions about it or don't understand something when you're reading it. Chances are we probably won't either, and we'll need to get clarification on it. But I do think it's a really good opportunity to make comments. And obviously, going back to the previous slide with the debt ceiling bill and the budgets, I think that in terms of messaging, just saying you're worried about the impact of this bill on services especially the cuts, and what you really, the services you really rely upon, and ask them for more information, or ask them to keep you informed on things that are going on with that, or tell them why they need to make sure that they go back and fix it. Like, they could go back when they're doing budgeting and exempt people with disabilities from the work requirements. You know, I think they should already do that, but and they may do it in rules, but it would be much better if it was listed in the legislation. I did want to, I'll kind of move on, and then if we have other questions, please feel free to talk about it. But, you know, Congress is different than the Iowa legislature. We only meet for 3 or 4 months. Congress meets year round, although I would guess that they don't work as much overall as the state does, because they have so many different, what they call state work periods. This is time that they give legislators to go back to their communities and meet with people, talk to their people, do all of the things, you know, meet with organizations. And they're usually around holidays. So they're usually a few weeks around a holiday. So like next week is a work period, and it goes through July 7th. So I had posted on our calendar and on our Facebook feed that Grassley has some town hall meetings next week, which are great opportunities to talk about these things that we just showed you. I'm trying to remember which counties they're in. They are on our legislative website, or on our, I'm sorry, on our DD Council website calendar, so you can see them. But I know they're in, you know, he does their county, 99 counties a year. So these are 4 counties, 2 in southern Iowa. I will look those up if you want me to, but I would look on our calendar for the dates. I thought I wrote them down. They also have an August recess, which is a big recess. They basically stay out of town, out of DC for August, which is probably good since DC was built on a swamp. It's probably horribly hot. It is horribly hot and terrible out there. But it is a lot of time that they do things like tours. They go on tours of different businesses. It could be a provider. You know, there's a lot of opportunities in there to find them. They're usually do parades and things like that. And so the news is they're actually back home for the month of August, and that goes through Labor Day. So it's actually through September 5th. Then they're out for Columbus Day, October 9th and 10th, for Thanksgiving, November 20th through the 24th, and then December for the holidays. Although those November and December dates are going to be pretty sketchy because they might have to stay in town to get a budget passed by January 1. So there's just real opportunity to make an impact on your federal legislators at that time. And I can't remember if it's the National Association of Developmental Disabilities Councils or another one, but this URL has some good tips on federal advocacy, and we certainly have some on our website too. But I wanted to just make a note of, for those that, you know, you are represented by 2 U.S. senators, so Senator Joni Ernst and Senator Grassley, and 1 U.S. representative, which I'm going to quickly turn over here, depending on where you live. So these are all the links to their websites where you can provide information, find where their schedules are in Iowa. So depending on where you live, you're represented by one of these individuals. But I want to just pause here. We have, I believe he's an expert, but Bob Bacon is online here with us. And I thought I would just have him maybe give a couple tips. He was a congressional fellow at one time, and certainly in his role with the university has done a lot of work with the federal delegation over the years. with many different faces in Congress and on a bipartisan level. And I just thought it might be nice to hear from an expert that apparently my federal tips link doesn't work, so I will fix that and before I put it on the website. And we will also have a link on our website as well. And I don't know, Bob, if you're available, it would just be nice to hear from someone like what your thoughts are and how people can talk to their federal delegation, email, or how, just any kind of tips from your experience working with the federal delegation. And if somebody can pin Bob, I think I can.
He's pinned, Amy. He's ready to go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Bob.
Okay, good. My goodness, that presentation was sobering from Amy. And it certainly underscores the need for all of us to have productive relationships with our federal officials. I was very fortunate in 1997 to have a fellowship that was sponsored by the Kennedy Foundation. And I spent actually a year there assigned to the Committee on Education and the Workforce. I was actually the first Kennedy Fellow to be assigned to the Republican side of in the House. And that's because in 1996, I was there in 1997, the Republicans had taken over Congress, so the action was going to be led by the Republican side. And it was in hindsight, the fact that I got a chance to really experience the importance of bipartisanship I don't think I could have learned that lesson as deeply if I didn't have the opportunity to be working with the Republican comrades. I think that our goal as advocates needs to be that we want to be reliable resources for legislators. And in order to be a reliable resource, you have to make sure that you are framing issues that make sense to them. And as much as possible, you need to be able to cite nonpartisan documentation. For example, the Congressional Research Service isn't something that we know too much about, that we think about too much, but it is an incredible resource, and it is it's legislatively supported, and it is a nonpartisan resource. So when you cite something from them, you will be getting attention. In terms of once you have once you've been seen as a reliable resource, it's important that your communication be succinct, and that you also appreciate the reality of compromise. We'll never get everything that we need as soon as we need it. That's just not the way it works. but if we can provide the information that policymakers need in a way that they can understand it. And like, for example, when I talk about framing issues in terms that make sense, think about community living versus institutional care. Community living, of course, we know is a right under Olmstead, but it's also more cost effective. And when you're talking with certain legislators, that's the point that you want to stress. So other points, it's important that you not just communicate with the senators or the House members. There's believe it or not, there's actually kind of a rivalry, at least there was back when I was there. The House members kind of felt like they had an inferiority complex because the senators were kind of thought that they were the more substantial body. But so it's important that not to kind of underestimate the rivalry between the two. What else? I had a few other notes here. But okay, so basically understanding the legitimate interests of all parties to an issue and appreciating the reality of compromise, doing your homework, arguing issues on their merits, being succinct, and using nonpartisan resources where possible. I guess, Amy, is that enough?
Amy, you're on mute, but you just give a thumbs up. Thank you so much for that, Bob. That was, I think, very helpful. I think Amy might be having some computer problems, but I don't know if you can move on to the next slide, Amy. Can you stop sharing your screen? Thank you so much for that, Bob. That is very helpful. And we did put in a link to, well, Tammy did too. I think my link was different. Oh, Tammy posted the Congressional Budget Office, also not Arson. So those are two good resources that you guys can use. I think that's the map of our federal folks. And then, okay. Did you want me to?
Sorry, I guess technical difficulties are my mouse ran out of batteries. And so nothing was moving. So I had to use my touch screen. Thank you so much, Bob. That was perfect.
Sure.
Absolutely perfect. You know, and I just think the more we can do with our federal officials, the better. In all the cases of the House, they're pretty new. You know, Ashley Hinson, this is her second term. Zach Nunn, it's his first. Marionette Miller-Meeks, it's her second. Feenstra, I think, is second too. So, I mean, they're all pretty brand new comparatively. When you look at like Chuck Grassley, who is one of the oldest members, not age-wise, but longest serving members in the Senate. So that was fantastic. I really appreciate that, Bob. And we'll continue to try to provide more resources on the federal level because it's a little different, but not that different. In this case, as you look at our congressional delegation, they are all former state legislators, either Senate, which Zach Nunn and Marionette Miller-Meeks and Feenstra were all in the Senate. Ashley Hinson was in the House. So they're very accustomed to having communications like they normally do in the legislature. Sometimes I just want to emphasize staff is important. So whereas in the legislature, we really don't have staff, these folks do, and they're the experts. So sometimes they will have you talk to their staff because they're the people they rely on to have those. So people like Bob, when he was a fellow, they rely on them to do the research and kind of come back with the ideas, and then they make a decision based on that. But I just want to emphasize, people might feel bad that they got bumped to staff. Don't, because I actually think staff is more important sometimes. They actually have that communication at the federal level.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Absolutely. And,
well,
and again, the idea of being, if you can be a reliable resource to staff, that's a tremendous potential.
Yes, absolutely. You know, there's all new staff, but some of the older staff that have been around, like before there was a Senator Harkin had a chief of staff who used to call me regularly and ask about different, would shoot ideas off of me. Richard Bender, which I know you probably know, Bob, but Richard used to come would shoot ideas off of us and make a call and say, hey, we're thinking about doing something like this. What do you think? That's a great position to be in. So they might call Tammy, because I see your name on the list here, and say, hey, what do you think about XYZ? That's usually a great position to be in.
And Amy, I was going to just say something about that too, is that I think that the staff changes a lot, and especially with the newer members. And anyway, but the names of the staff members that work on their, sometimes it's disability policy, mostly it might be health, the health policy assistant or that kind of thing. And if you could find that person on their website or something, for sure, copy them in on anything you send to the actual member, or maybe you just want to send something to them and say, what information do you need on this? Because that's exactly right. When they call you for help, Amy, that's the gold standard of what you're after when you develop these relationships.
Yep.
Writing down notes. Absolutely. Well, and again, you have our emails. So if anybody on the call wants to follow up with ideas or thoughts or help in doing that, just let us know. It's probably best to include all of us on that, all three of us, Brooke, Carlin, and I, just because vacations and illness or something, you'll get a faster response if all three of us are on that, just to double check. I'm really glad I moved my July vacation to the end of July if they're having a special session, because if legislators in town, I like to be there, even if I don't care about the issue. So I do want to, speaking ahead, we have the last 15 minutes here. I want to get ready for next year. It's time. You should be talking to legislators about what you want next year, because they're getting their lists together. They can request bills during the summer, which is great, because that just makes sure they get done and written before session starts so they can get introduced faster. We have a really fast timeline in the second year of a 2-year legislative cycle. So we, only are there for 10 days or 100 days, or 10 less days. And then those deadlines move up pretty quickly. So like the date to get bill draft requests in is really that first week, and then you can't request again. So the more we start talking about it, better. And I just wanted to emphasize, here's what we had last year for the Iowa DD Council. They were pretty broad, although underneath that we had specific requests. But obviously workforce continues to be a big issue, inclusive and accessible community, which is, I would say, probably harder to define for people because there's so many things that feed into that. And then reduce or eliminate, and really bold, eliminate all HCBS waiver waiting lists. So those Medicaid waiting lists. And I think you've seen a couple strategies to do that, whether it's just fully funding that so they can pay it, or changing how the waivers are administered and how they are designed, which is something that is what HHS is looking at right now. There's just a lot of ways to get to that. And so those were our priorities for next year. Certainly, we didn't really fix any of those in the 2023 session, but we wanted to have a discussion about where we go next year for the council, because they are going to be starting to work on that right now. And so we have a couple polling questions. I'm going to turn it over to Carlin and Brooke and Emily to sort of talk about and ask some questions to get us kind of get your thoughts on it.
I think we have 2 polls put together that list some specific ideas for what we can include in our agenda, and also what you would think is most important to talk to your legislator about in the coming session. And it helps us get a feel for where your priorities are and what we might want to focus on. We're wanting to, get more specific this year. One of the things that I was asked several times when I was talking to legislators is like, what bills are you working on? Instead of kind of these broad ideas of, wow, we need to make Iowa more accessible, it's like, get down to the nitty gritty. What can we put in place, and what could we be specifically working on, and maybe even specifically proposing in legislation. So we'd like to hear your ideas on that too. And we're starting our draft of our agenda this month, and we're going to be working on it for the next couple of months at least. And do want to get as much input as we can before we finalize anything before the session starts, and hopefully start working on legislators who we know can be supportive of our initiatives and our proposals, and we can get that started early this year too. So Emily, I think, is the master of the polls that we have, the 2 questions that we have. This one is asking what your top 3 issues or topics you would want the Iowa DD Council to work on in the coming legislative session. And this is, at the state level. And some of these are broad again for kind of helping us look at big picture issues. And then the next question will be a little bit more specific. So accessible communities, the direct support workforce. So we've been talking about DSPs, direct support professionals, for many years, and that's going to continue. But what we heard this year was we need some innovative ideas. It can't be just we need more money to pay these folks. What are some other innovative ideas? Where can we get the funding to pay these folks? So that's also what we're looking for idea-wise. Education, this year was a big area where issues came up that we didn't think would come up, that would be affecting children who are in special education, students who need transition services, voc rehab. There were budget cuts in many of those areas. So I think that's something that's not on a lot of people's radar, because we were all pretty comfortable with where things were with education. And a lot of things have changed in that area just in 1 year that we will definitely be keeping an eye on. If not, looking at maybe suggesting some budget recommendations in that area. And always employment, access to care includes Medicaid. Transportation issues are ones that we're all also looking at some very specific ideas and suggestions, innovative ideas. And as the DD Council has been known for advocating for voting and elections that are accessible, and that includes caucuses, which has been a topic this year too, that we're going to be talking a little bit more about. We will be talking about that at our Make Your Mark conference. So,
and if you do have other, please go ahead and just put those in the chat. If we're missing something here, we definitely want to know about that. It looks like a few people did answer other, so go ahead and just put those in the chat for us.
Do you have a second? I can make a couple comments.
Sure.
Well, I did put other, and one of the others that I have in mind is the broadband and the access with technology and that sort of thing. And not just the fact of getting a wire to my house, but what accessibility do I have and what training do I have on using it? Because I have found that working with some self-advocates, a real big challenge is even if they have the internet, they don't have the support to get on their laptop, to get on their Zoom link. And so it's not just like the wire, it's the workings of it to be fully included in the community. That's one thing. And the other thing was on employment. And I think the employment workforce crisis, I think we could do a lot in Iowa and elsewhere, obviously, about facilitating people with disabilities to meet the workforce needs of our state. And not just the workforce needs in the way of a direct workforce serving others with disabilities, but just the whole workforce issue as a labor market thing. And sometimes I think that those maybe nuanced or broader perspectives are not like included in the conversations. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Tammy. I think we're going to go ahead and end this poll so we can get up our second poll before people start to drop off. But thanks everybody for that. And then we'll go to our next one, I think, or I don't know, I guess let's just share the results real quick, Emily. It looks like, oh, maybe I'm doing that. So people can see them. I'm not sure if everybody can see it. And then we'll go to our next question. So as Carolyn said, this is more specific.
Yeah, this just kind of ask for you to hone in on one thing that you would like to ask your legislators to do in the next session. Direct support wages by at least $5 an hour, which, you know, is kind of one of those dream levels. If we start high, as Bob said, we have to be willing to compromise. So starting high is probably a good idea especially when it comes to funding that could be quite high. There's some education, earning potential, some specifics to workforce again. Some of the options about Medicaid are, you know, actually being discussed. So that's good. And, you know, reinforcing what we have been asking for many years is still a good thing.
Yeah, again, you have our emails on there too. If you don't want to put something in the chat and you think of something later, go ahead and email it to us. Because it was literally the three of us just coming up with ideas for these answers. So I know there's many, many more that you guys have in your minds.
Yes, we want to hear from you, so please.
And Garrett has his hand up. Garrett, did you have a question?
I liked many of those that you listed, but is there any way that you guys could like put all those in the chat, or like send an email out or something? Because many of those directly relate to us, or many of us. And then the only thing I was going to say or mention earlier, just a couple of moments ago, I believe Tammy was speaking, but for us that are disabled, it's kind of hard for us to work because just for an example, I myself, I received SSI, not SSDI, So my income level on paper is higher. So if I were to work, then I would either lose benefits or I would have to have a job that would be able to compensate me where it's almost like a six-figure dollar job, which there may be a few out there, but I don't want to risk losing my benefits if I would work. So I kind of watch every month, you know, how much I have in my bank account. I can't really have any assets. I can't save money. I can't do too much. So it's kind of limiting some of us when we talk about employment. But that's all. I found that whole list interesting because when you talk about public education or more funding for education, that's me. That was my first court case in which it was determined by the U.S. Supreme Court 24 years ago. There, it's still up there. Fun, accessible education. But it's been 24 years, I guess, since that determination was finalized back in 1999. And so, like, that's really meaningful. But all of these kind of pertain to us. You know, develop a statewide alert system that includes all people with disabilities. Just going to the duration that was difficult. Change Medicaid waivers. That's really important. The waiting list also. But and then for myself, I know I said increase direct support wages, but I think that might be helpful to retain and just have quality of care for our people with disabilities, anyone that has disability. But I'll stop there. I really appreciate all three of you coming up with those because they are very important. But
Garrett, thanks for that. I think Amy is going to include those 2 poll questions in our summer newsletter that will be going out here in this next week. So, but thank you for that feedback, Garrett. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Garrett.
Yeah, excellent, Garrett. And that's kind of a lot of what you brought up is what, Josh Turek, Representative Turek has been talking about. I think he even used the term forced poverty, like forcing you to stay in poverty rather than, realizing your full earning potential without risking those services. So I think that's a step, with this legislature work.
Amy, just to interrupt you, we're losing our interpreter, so we're probably going to need to really shut it down without an interpreter. So
got it. So I would just, I just threw up these. I wanted to make sure everybody knew what was coming up ahead. Next Capital Chat comes right before our Make Your Mark conference. Take Your Legislator to Work Week, October, or Work Month. Be thinking about that if you want to do that. I'm sure we're recruiting soon. We've got the Youth Leadership Academy coming up next month. So a lot going on this summer, but they are all on our calendar and events on the website. So thank you guys for.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good summer.